we'll put you in through the phone, and if your speakers are off on your computer, we shouldn't get an echo.
Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Okay. There we are. Hi.
Hello.
I know therapists are such great audio and video experts, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Sue, and I don't think that everyone heard when you were talking about the computer problems you've been having, that the last nearly a week, not even quite a week ago, you lost everything. Your hard drive crashed. And
my backup.
It's been very difficult, right?
Yes, I didn't even know that you could lose all your backups at the same time, but I thought I was completely safe, and apparently not. But hopefully now I am, but I wasn't. So I've had a rather difficult crisis type few days. Anyway.
Yeah, it's very
much. We survived. You know, we did live before we had computers. But it is good to know that you do keep breathing even when, you know, everything crashes, and you do keep breathing. So anyway, so what are we talking about today, Becca?
So we're talking about assembling emotions. You've made a couple tweaks on the Tango chart and emphasizing the assembly of emotion. And so that's what we're talking about, and this how important that is to assemble emotion, and why we do that.
Okay, so we can talk about that, and we can talk about the EFT Tango, you know, and I don't know whether the folks who are listening, you know, some of them probably heard me talk years ago when I wasn't even talking about these things. But hopefully we grow in EFT, and we consolidate things, and we refine things, and we integrate things. I hope we do. So, and this is, I've been talking about the EFT Tango for a while, and I've been talking about emotion for a while, but I haven't been quite using the same language or going into it so much. And some of that is that I've just finished a new book that will come out, I hope, by the end of the year, called Safe and Sound. And it will come out with Guildford, and it's attachment as a essential guide for 21st century psychotherapy, individual, couple, and family. And as part of writing that book, you know, I really went into thinking about EFT and what it is that's unique about what we do, and what it is that's powerful about what we do. And the conclusion I came to, having launched myself into this huge field called psychotherapy, and looked at all the things that people were doing across the spectrum, you know, there's now hundreds and hundreds of names for psychotherapy, and over 400 systematic manualized treatments. And, you know, it's just sort of becoming wild, and it's very confusing because, of course, people use the same different names for the same interventions, and everyone is territorial, so we all want to, you know, I read people like behaviorists talking about empathy, and I feel like saying, hey, excuse me, like we've been doing this, talking about reflective empathy like they invented it, and I say, excuse me, we've been doing this for a while. But, you know, hopefully we can all grow together. So we have always used Magda Arnold's elements of emotion, right? We've always looked at and we said, what's an emotion? Emotion is all these elements. It's an experience. It's in the body. It's embodied. And it's got all these elements. And emotion is a very high-powered information processing system that's designed for you to orientate you to the world, to tell you what your needs are, and to move you into action in the service of your needs. But as I looked around at this whole field, it really hit me that, you know, we've kind of talked about this for years, but actually I think it's pretty unique to EFT that we kind of march straight into emotion, and we actually very systematically go into these elements and we very systematically reach for them, search for them, ask questions, pick up nonverbal cues from our clients, and help our clients put them together. And so what hit me about that is, we don't just label an emotion or ask a question or give an interpretation of it. We actually help people assemble it. And a lot of that is, how do we do that? Well, we use Magda Arnold's elements. There's a trigger, there's a basic perception, which is usually very global. It's, safety, danger, pleasure, pain, good, bad, perception, and then there's bodily feeling. And it's quite interesting to me that even people who tell you that they're not emotional and they don't know much about their emotions, if you really stay with them and make them feel safe, they can nearly always find a bodily feeling.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
There's a bodily feeling, then there's a meaning making a part of emotion. And the simplest way to talk about that with people is to simply say, what do you tell yourself as this happening, or what does this emotion say to you? And then there's an action tendency. But what we do is we go in and we deliberately find those things, and then we help people put them all together in a living context where that emotion is relevant right here and now. So we go into the lived experience and we help people put it all together in a particular way, in a safe environment. That in itself seems to me is therapeutic. Yeah. Because for lots of people we see, it's not just that they live a long way from their emotions or they don't listen to their emotions. For a lot of the people we see, there's another level, which is that they're scared of their emotions. And they literally, it's like foreign territory for them. They don't feel competent to really grasp their own experience and make sense of it. Good example of that is John and Julia on the training tape that we did, re-engaging with droids.
Yep.
He basically says, well, I don't know. And then I'm pushing, I'm asking questions, evocative questions, and reflecting to try and get him into his emotions. And he's obviously talking about fear. But at one point he says, well, I don't want to feel it. I spend my whole life doing, basically looking for distractions, right? He talks about, like Fonzik, the character way back on the television, this dude that was on television that was always playing roles and going off and riding motorbikes and absolutely avoiding any awareness of his inner experience. So people are actually phobic of their emotions.
Yeah.
And I think something happens in EFT that we maybe could talk about more, which is terribly basic in good psychotherapy, but we don't really pay that much attention to it, which is we take people into their emotions in a safe way. We help them put that emotion all together in a way that gives them a sense of control and grounds them. And when we do that, they begin to feel competent to make their own experience coherent. Right? So we
and they feel so much better. They feel so much better when they start to have some coherency of their experience.
That's right. And it's a safe thing to do. So they feel competent and they feel grounded. They're able to put their experience together. And that in itself is, sort of gives somebody, if you like, secure base, a place to stand on. I mean, it's what a mother does, a good mother does with a baby. The baby looks at something, she hasn't had words for it, has a visceral reaction to whatever this is, a big strange thing, right? Maybe she doesn't have a word for dog, or she doesn't know what it is, it's strange. What does the mother do? The mother says, oh, you're hiding your head in my knee. Oh, yes, you don't want to look at the doggy. It's a doggy. The doggy's okay. It's safe. You're scared of the doggy. yes, but it's okay, I'm here. But you want to turn away from the doggy, yes, because you think the doggy's scary. Listen to what the mother's doing. She's assembling not just what the dog is and the external environment, she's assembling the internal world for the kid. And so the kid starts to be able to put the internal world together. So I just got all hung up on this word. I got all that. I thought, we sit and we assemble people's emotions with them, and we also normalize and validate very deliberately and sit with them while they integrate it and put it together and own it, right? And we do that in a very, what I think is a very organic way. We don't do what Fritz Perls, I've just been reading a bit on Fritz Perls, we don't do what Fritz Perls did, which is to, give people a hard time and tell them to be responsible, and that, if they don't know, if you say I don't know, then that's a choice, and you're deliberately not knowing. And Fritz Perls was a fascinating guy. He wanted everybody to be responsible and free, but he also wanted to tell them exactly what to do all the time and have them listen to him. So he was an interesting character. But we don't, do huge interpretations. We don't label something and then tell people how to cope with it. It's useful to think what we don't do in EFT, and that's part of what I was doing, writing this new book. I'm trying to find our place in the field of psychotherapy, right? So
one of the things that we do,
in the field of psychotherapy.
One of the things that we do, Sue, or that we've done with Arnold's work, is try to put it in that infinity diagram of the negative cycle, where we have those elements, but we are, we need to translate those elements to the negative cycle diagram that everyone is so familiar with, because we use a little bit of different language when we start talking about unmet attachment needs and primary emotion and secondary emotion. The meaning making and the behavior is really clear on our negative cycle diagram, but how it goes from primary to secondary, how that translates to Arnold, and the unmet attachment need. So
it's so interesting, because I don't even use primary and secondary anymore. For me, there's something confusing about it. I use, and that was actually from way back when Les Greenberg and I were working collegially, and that was his idea of primary and secondary. I think of it more simply in terms of surface emotion and deeper emotion, actually. And, the surface emotion is often just reactive, and there's much more hidden than you see.
Yeah.
It's reactive, and it's what people are comfortable with in that particular situation. So, I show you silence, and it looks as if I'm indifferent and cool. In fact, it hides the fact that I'm completely overwhelmed.
Right.
But, if you ask, if your partner says what's happening to you and you don't say anything, your partner says you don't even care, you're just indifferent, you don't feel anything. Whereas, deep inside you feel a whole bunch of things.
Right.
So, yes, we do add levels to it. I think the other thing we do that's different, we tune into the emotional channel differently than other approaches. And I think even differently than our colleagues who, come out of the same family, like Les Greenberg's colleagues, for example, who are doing what he calls emotion focused. By the way, it gets terribly confusing, because now David Barlow, who's a cognitive behaviorist, is talking about his work as emotion focused. So suddenly everybody's emotion focused, which means we're all totally confused. So, so I think we have a different way of going in, and I think we then bring that emotion out into the interpersonal context in a different way than anyone else does.
Right.
And what I talk about in this new book is that if you ground your approach to therapy in attachment science, you always are flipping, whether you're doing individual, couple, or family therapy, you're always flipping between intrapsychic and interpersonal, because those two things define each other, and because that's where we live as human beings. We live in our inner world, and we live in connection with other people. Even if when other people aren't there with us, we internalize them, we represent them in our heads. So we live in this interpersonal, intrapsychic world. So yeah, what we help people do is assemble their emotions in a clearer, safer, and those things go together, in a clearer, safer, more coherent way, right? And then what we do is we distill that, and we help them then turn to the, that might, if there's no one else, they turn to the therapist, or they turn to a part of themselves, right, that they experience as kind of other and separate. But often we'll have them turn to people in their lives. I'm thinking of me, in the book I give an example of a woman I work with who had very high anxiety and quite a bit of depression. And her key issue is that she had an affair about 6 years before, for which she cannot forgive herself. And her husband has stayed in contact with her over the 6 years and wants to get back with her. But she really cannot tolerate this, even though she wants to get back with him, because deep down she knows that she's completely unworthy and a complete failure. And all she does is listen to this part of her that beats her up all the time. When you really listen to that voice she's talking about, I'm much more likely, I think, than Dick Schwartz or Les Greenberg. Instead of saying, talk to your inner critic, I get a bit allergic to that phrase somehow, I don't know why. Talk to your inner critic. I'm much more likely to say, who taught you to be so critical of yourself? And she'll say, I'll go with an attachment figure. She'll say, my dad. But then when she talks about her dad, she's a little bit upset, but she's not off balance. When she talks about her older sister, she goes red in the face, and her breathing changes, and her voice changes. And so I say, let's talk about your older sister and the messages she gave you about who you were, and the messages she gives you now. And then there's a lot of emotion. So we'll end up distilling this pain that she has, and we start with her talking to her, closing her eyes. I don't do what some people call furniture therapy anymore, okay? I just get people to close their eyes. I say, tell your sister about your pain, and she can't even, so that's too hard. Tell your dad about your pain. She can tell him a little bit. Then she can imagine what he says back, right? So this is us. It's basically Gestalt. It's a Gestalt technique, and humanistic psychologists have used it for years. So then we do that, but we're always going from working with the process of putting together inner emotions and translating it into working with the process of interacting with key important others in our lives, whether they're there or whether they're just in our heads, right? And so you're right, it links to the cycle, right?
Right.
And the thing about that one is, I saw her 9 times. In that 9 times, her depression dropped totally. Her anxiety went down about 2 standard deviations. She started talking to her husband in a whole different way. By the end of therapy, they decided to try moving in together. But therapy was that she could have a conversation with her older sister. And in that conversation, she could be clear, coherent, assertive. She could define herself with her older sister. And she could also talk to her older sister about how much she wanted her approval and how she never got it, and how, from her point of view, her older sister, she idealized her older sister, and her older sister always about how we fit. Writing the book is how we fit in the field of psychotherapy, how we are similar to other approaches, how we're different. I mean, one of the main differences that makes us different is that EFT developed as a couples therapy.
Right.
So it developed with that alive attachment in the room. It developed with intrapsychic and interpersonal in the room. That's how it developed, right? Even though now we use it with, we always use it with individuals and families. We just haven't talked that much about it.
Right. So, Sue, this going back to putting the elements together in Arnold and then making it interpersonal. I just want to throw up this. See, I'm going to see if this works. If I can share my screen, and see if we can see this slide. That I'm not sure. I'm going to try something tricky here and see if it works. And I think you'll be able to see it as well. Okay, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, my entire screen. Okay. So let's see if I can. So we've got this, Lori Brubaker put the John and Julia cycle on Arnold's elements, the process of emotion, so that we could kind of see how it relates to the interpersonal part, to the negative cycle. And that limbic appraisal that you talk about, danger, safety, those simple codes that we make, really, to me, and this is where I'm asking for your clarification for me and for our listeners here. That limbic appraisal kind of meets with the unmet attachment need, because if I'm secure and safe, I don't get that alarm necessarily, or I'm able to do something with that alarm. And then it goes into the bodily arousal, which we, as we unpack it, that primary emotion, the pain of, or the fear, we're often using fear as the motivating driver of the negative cycle, but there will be layers of emotion that to get down to it. And then as it goes more surface. So just in relation to kind of how we are, kind of taught, or trainers are talking about it in externships, putting it over the interpersonal dynamic here. Maybe you can just address this a little bit, as we're maybe new terms to many folks listening around limbic appraisal, bodily arousal, and then going into emotion, right?
Well, to be honest, when I'm looking at this diagram, Becca, I find it pretty confusing. And that's the truth.
Yeah.
So, because for me, it's like there's a straight line with any emotion. The first thing that happens is there's a cue, and then what you get is body arousal, right? And that's what happens. And there's a meaning that you don't always elaborate on, especially if that emotion's difficult for you to register. There's a meaning, and there's an action tendency. But if you think about fear, if I don't want to feel fear, if I feel stupid when I feel fear, if I don't want to admit that I feel fear, if it's difficult for me, all these things I'm telling you about will never be put together. They'll never be really touched on. They'll just be kind of run past. And what I'll often do with my partner is I'll pick up a response to that, my action tendency in the surface emotion is to cope with the emotion. My action tendency is kind of step aside from the experiencing and to cope with the emotion. So
right.
What I do is I turn and I flip into rage because that gives me some control. So then the fear, all the elements of the fear are kind of left hanging. They're never really put together. They're never tasted. I flip into the cope reactive mode.
Right.
And if you ask me how I feel, I'll tell you I'm angry. But actually what we do in EFT is we assume that before anger, before that kind of defensive reaction, right,
yep.
There's a threat. So we'll always want to go down into the threat. But if I look at this diagram, I get confused.
Yes, so the diagram, because if you're confused, probably other people are confused as well. So it's because it's trying to put it interpersonal. So the environmental cue would start, in this case, with Julie going out with a friend, which moves over to John's limbic arousal, bodily arousal, limbic appraisal, bodily arousal, and then, moves up to the elements as you were just talking.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, yeah, I get that.
So it's happening, it happens to both.
Out with a friend.
Yeah, that's right.
And, what happens to John is a danger alarm bell, right? And then he comes up and he flips into secondary emotion.
Right.
And, says, when he's angry, he doesn't say, I could lose you, I'll be all alone. He just says, you're not taking care of yourself. And then he snaps and he shuts down, right?
Yeah.
That's right. But what I'm saying is I'm not sure this diagram really helps terribly.
Yeah.
I think the bottom line is we put together the emotional music, we put together it in a particular way, and then we communicate it to our partner. And that music then becomes an emotional cue for our partner. And our partner then processes that, and I think what happens in more secure attachment is that people can slow all that down. They can slow that process down, and they can tolerate, their own vulnerability. They don't believe that they'll be all alone in that vulnerability. There's some part of them that believes that other people will support them. So they can actually, even while they're getting angry, there's some part of them that's able to reflect on that and able to say, gee, why am I so angry about this, right?
Yeah.
There's some part of them that's even aware enough to register that when they get angry, their partner looks alarmed. They're much more present. Their awareness is wider than somebody who's really insecure and really into reactive mode and desperately trying to avoid their vulnerability and flipping into a defensive mechanism, right?
Right.
So the secure person, though, will still, get angry. The point is they don't stay there as long. They're also able to change channel. One of the things that really hits me about that's very true of more secure folks, and we see it at the end of EFT, that when you first get a couple in, they can't change channel from surface to deeper emotion. They can't change channel from defensive mechanism to their own vulnerability.
And
they
even when we help them,
you're a creep,
yep,
to I feel scared, right? They can't change those channels.
And but even when we help them change, they can't stay there, right?
That's right. They can change for 2 seconds and then they're back. But by the end, if we've done our job, they know more about their inner world. It's not so uncertain. They know more about their partner and what's going to happen between their partner and them. So then they can change channel and they can stay there. It's so interesting. I'm working with a couple right now where this lady, I think she is the most reactive, angry enraged lady I've ever worked with, which is fascinating.
She's the lady that you were talking about At the summit?
She's had no trauma, right? No anything. But she grits her fists and screams her head off. That's enraged, okay? So, but what's interesting is you can actually see her start to come out of that. And the interesting thing is that for her to start to come out of it, what I had to do is again and again validate her rage. Validate. I had to start where she was. That's the other thing we do that's different in EFT. So many approaches to therapy go from where the client is, where the client's uncomfortable, and try to shift them immediately, how to get them to cope. We don't. We go into where they are. We go in and we stay there, right? And that's experiential humanistic therapists do that. But I think in couple therapy, we're unique in doing that. We don't fix it.
Although it's very hard to do at first. That's very hard to do because we know there's softer, sweeter, more vulnerable underneath that. And many times as we're learning, and I'm very guilty of it myself, I try to go under it to something softer instead of be right there with it in the way you're describing.
Yes. Well, every time I tried to get her to add a piece to her anger or to, maybe let in the fact that he wasn't deliberately trying to abandon her, I hit a wall. So what I've learned to do is, if I'm not making progress, I back up and stay with where the client is. You stay in the stuck place. So then I validate her and I say, my sense is that you're so angry because from your point of view, this man never shows up. He never shows up in this relationship. He doesn't, you're talking about chores, but my sense is you don't feel like he shows up anyway. He doesn't show up emotionally. He doesn't show up sexually. He doesn't show up, and I have to be careful. I have to say, and I understand that that's not the way you see it, husband. Although actually he shakes his head and he says, no, that's right. I don't. He says, bless his heart. He says, that's right. I don't show up because I'm terrified.
Yeah. And that is something we do so different, which is to welcome the reactivity and not try to take it away from people.
That's right. Because, it's you let them have it and then they start to feel safe. And then they start to be willing to explore what's underneath it, right? Yeah. It's if you look at it in the big scheme of things, all therapists try to deal with vulnerability, how people cope with their vulnerability, right? And how do we half of the therapeutic world is trying to teach people how to manage their vulnerability, it seems to me, and a smaller part of the therapeutic world is trying to help people move into that vulnerability and tolerate it and kind of learn from it and, manage it in a different way, manage it from the inside out, not from the outside in.
Yeah.
And so, that's why we don't teach people skills per se. Yeah.
Right. So Sue, we're getting I know you have to go, so maybe I don't want to ask you this question. You tell me how you are on time.
You can ask me.
Okay, so
you can ask me a question.
So the question is, if the cycle diagram with Arnold overlaid on it, is confusing, is there a better way? How would you imagine overlaying Arnold onto the interpersonal dynamic? Is there a way that you would see it? That
the way I see it is I see it in terms of metaphor. For me, I can't do therapy without metaphors. Metaphor is just speaking of one thing in terms of another, speaking of the implicit in terms of the explicit. So I always think of it in terms of music and dance.
Yeah.
I couldn't do those two images are totally basic for me. I put together my emotions, I assemble my emotions, and I have different levels of awareness. I either react to my own emotion, I react to threat with rage, or I'm more able to stay with my emotion, and I'm able to coherently put it together or not. This is how I'm processing the emotion. But then as I'm trying to process it, usually what happens is I'm expressing something out in the world. And if people don't feel safe, what they express, we're not terribly intricate as human beings. If people don't feel safe with emotion, they either express anger, which is protective, I'm going to assert myself, I'm going to take control, or they express very little. And one way of doing that is to intellectualize. The other way is to just go numb and silent, right? So you shut down, or you become more and more active. And really, that's about it for our expression in these situations we're talking about. You ramp the emotion up, or you try to tamp it down, and become more and more. So then you express this music to your partner. It goes across between the space between you, and it becomes an emotional cue for your partner.
So part of what happens to one of the things that I'm thinking about in relation to the dance metaphor and the music, and also Arnold, here at the same time, is that what the cycle diagram does is add this unmet attachment need, right? Which really we might just translate as to it's another emotion that's often missing in the dance, this longing or the desire, the need for safety or expression,
yes.
Right? A need for a different music, perhaps. So when it comes
yes.
to the emotion, there's an element, there's a channel that we're missing, really, in the negative cycle.
Yes. You can think about it that I think about it that there's a deprivation of that attachment need.
Yes.
And that's why the threat is so huge.
That's right.
If there was no deprivation of the attachment need, securely attached folks process their emotion differently. So there is a threat, but it's not as big, it's not as overwhelming, it's more coherent, it's more manageable, you can tolerate it more. So that threat is there.
And so that's really why Arnold's bodily limbic appraisal and bodily arousal piece fits right in there with kind of the unmet attachment need, and then the emerging primary emotion as it gets more safe to stay and hang out there.
Yeah. The unmet attachment need, it's the other side of the enormity of the threat.
Right.
See, I talk about the threat all the time, the threat of isolation, the threat of being abandoned, the threat of being rejected. I've been reading Irvin Yalom's Existential Psychotherapy because I'm going to interview him at the Networker for hours, it appears. I thought it was just 40 minutes, but apparently not. So I've been reading his stuff, and what he talks about all the time is that, deep down, we're all afraid of annihilation and death, okay, and isolation, meaninglessness, and something else. Right. I can't remember now. Okay. But, I say, okay, fine. But for me, as an attachment theorist, all that kind of gets channeled into the threat of emotional isolation, abandonment, and rejection, because as an attachment theorist, I believe that the way our brain is coded is that emotional isolation translates into your mammalian brain. It does translate into death, meaninglessness, isolation, and lack of choice. Right. Because it's kind of the ultimate threat, if you like. It's, nightmares by definition are places where you meet horrible dangers and you're by yourself. There's nobody standing beside you fighting for you. Otherwise, it's not a nightmare. So it's going to be kind of interesting for me to talk to Yalom because he's into, death. He's big into death, staring at the sun. Right? And I'm big into isolation. So we have a slightly different idea about what the ultimate threat is. If you listen to people talk about death, lots of times their biggest fear is to die alone, to not have someone with them.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that says something. And if you listen to our hymns in spirituality, you know, abide with me. When, you know, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. It's like the ultimate for a bonding mammal is to be with. And if you're with, it's almost like you can tolerate anything, even the fear of obliteration. But when you're alone, you can tolerate anything. So It's kind of different.
Well,
this has been a strange interview, Becca. We've had terrible technical difficulties.
We have. It's been really tough. And we've had a wonderful group of people hanging out with us.
But I'm afraid I'm going to have to go because I have another appointment.
I know. Thank you for staying, Sue.
I'm sorry if we were a bit discombobbled.
Thank you so much for taking the time and hanging out and, you know, helping us be creative and finding a way that people can hear you and hear these new thoughts and the things that you're working on. It's really cool the way we continue to grow and emerge and find better ways helpful ways to continue to help learn and use this wonderful model, Sue. So thank you so very much.
And I think you said something important. You know, it's like that we continue to learn, and that we don't get stuck, you know, and decide that we're terrific, you know. I mean, we are terrific, but let's not stay there. Let's get more terrific. You know, it's like we continue to learn from each other, and that's the whole point of an EFT community for me, that we can all learn from each other. Yeah. So nice to talk to you, Becca.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, sweetie. Bye-bye.
Okay, so that was really fun, and Sue is just signing off her computer now. She's on her way to another appointment. Thank you so much for hanging out with us and, you know, going through the technical difficulties and still being here and providing input and feedback and greeting each other. It's just wonderful to be part of this community where we are learning and growing and helping our couples and individuals, as Sue was also talking about today, be able to have more satisfying, happy relationships and better lives. So Sue's book is not out yet. I think it's going to be published in the fall. She's just completed writing it. She's been working on too. So again, thank you. And if you have